Good afternoon, everyone. I'm particularly pleased to see you, the intrepid ocean liner fanatics who would give up a beautiful day outside to be with us here. Very important, and I'm most appreciative. To begin with, I'd like to thank the Lowell Institute for making this day of programming possible, and also to mention that this event is being live streamed. So to give a quick shout out and welcome and thanks to our online viewers. And so we are here to celebrate the opening of Ocean Liner's Glamour, Speed, and Style. I'm Dan Finamore. I'm the co-curator of the exhibition and the Russell W. Knight Curator of Maritime Art and History here at the Peabody Essex Museum. The great age of ocean travel, of course, has long since passed, but liners remain among the most powerful and admired symbols of 20th century modernity. And today we're going to take a deep dive into aspects of the exhibition that show us just how and why that is so. So the order of events today, I think, will be that I'll give you somewhat of a brief overview of how the show came together and offer a few personal insights into bits of excitement along the way. And then we've asked two members of our curatorial team to take a close look at one of their sort of favorite works in the show and to talk about why they find them to be so interesting and inspiring. Those two are Ghislaine Wood, who's the co-curator of the exhibition. She's now deputy director of the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts in Norwich, as they pronounce it, UK. And George Schwartz, who's a curatorial scholar here at PEM. And I do want to point out that we do also have other members of our team which helped to pull this together. So we can't say that just the three of us did it all. There were a couple more members over there in Britain and another member here who were all part of the team. But after George and Ghislaine do their bits, we'll hear from someone with a very interesting perspective, very different on ocean liner design, Scott Wilson of Wilson Butler Architects. Which is based right here in Boston, which I think is one of the most interesting facets of the whole thing. So he's a practitioner of contemporary cruise ship design, and he will share some of his insights on the modern legacy of ocean liners as it's expressed in ships that are active today. So each of us will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we can hold a conversation here with some questions from the audience as well. So without further ado, I will jump right in. Sorry about that. What we see here in the, just organize, coordinate all these tangled wires and whatnot. What we're looking at here is a painting that I would hope that many of you would actually recognize because it's been a mainstay of the Peabody Essex Museum collection for quite some time. And it is a scene of the steamer Britannia of 1840, crossing the Atlantic in very stormy weather. In 1840, Samuel Cunard was awarded the contract, or maybe it was 39, to build and and initiate what essentially became regular ocean liner service, transatlantic, from Britain to Canada and then to the United States. And so the steamer Britannia was the first engaged in the regular service in what we know today as the great age of ocean liners. So this is a wonderful painting of that ship, and clearly I think it highlights what we now know to be the dirty and the dangerous and the potentially sickening side of the topic, rather than the socially glamorous side of things. But the industry rapidly evolved, and so we move on from there. It's not in the show, as a matter of fact, which I think is an interesting facet of it. It's on the first floor down below. But a distinctly different perspective on ocean liners was to be found across the pond here. Both the Peabody Essex Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum, working as partner institutions, have long been sort of steeped in the subject of ocean liners, though from very, very different perspectives. Here at PEM, we've collected ocean liner art and artifacts from a maritime perspective, of course. Paintings, models, posters, menus, and decorative items that really convey the experience of life on board these ships. The V&A, rather, has been collecting ocean liner works as they reflect design, superlative design and forward-looking design. So at the outset of the project, we decided that it seemed rather, our collections were very symbiotic and complemented one another in a way that allowed us to organize an exhibition that was far more comprehensive and solid than each of our institutions could try to do individually. So although both museums have strong collections, we really wanted to present the first truly international overview of more than 100 years of ocean liner history. All previous exhibitions related to ocean liners that I have seen and that we have done research on and know anything about have focused on the ships of, well, one ship or one line or the lines of one nation. But never has there been a truly international, comprehensive, across-the-board sort of overview that looked at ships from Germany and from France and from Britain and from Italy and from the United States and so on. So in order to do that, Ghislaine and I had to take the bull by the horns and begin our international travels. And as a result, the show includes loans from more than 50 lenders in 6 countries. And here we are, struggling hard at work on doing our research on board the Queen Mary, which is in Long Beach, California. And then we went down below on the Queen Mary in Long Beach. And that ship is a museum in itself, of course. For any of you who have been there, you know. But one of the things we liked there was this giant spanner designed for removing the big nut that holds the propeller on. It's really kind of an amazing specialized device. But I think we achieved the sense of scale of these ships in other ways up in the galleries. Although it was a great thing, it was not for us in the long haul. That was our shrewd curatorial decision. So we traveled through very, very interesting stops. One interesting stop was the French line archives in Le Havre, a dusty, I think it's fair to say, poorly lit warehouse filled with treasures that were taken off of French ships of various lines that all were consolidated into the French lines over time. And we really had an inspiring time looking at things there. Here, an architectural model for a large Beaux-Arts piece of architecture that was built in Paris. And this is just an evocative sort of view of sort of the stranger spaces in that warehouse. And we looked at all sorts of things that were taken off. We looked at lots of furniture. As you can see, plenty of chairs. Each ship had plenty of chairs. And so of many different designs. So it was actually quite inspiring and interesting, but I just thought it was amusing to see all of these chairs and let you know the sorts of things that we were looking at. We consulted with ocean liner historians of various sorts, excuse me there, yep, and modern cruise ship designers and other experts. Here we are, consulting. And some material was stored in ducal palaces, such as here in Genoa, but certainly not all of it, I will say. We poked through places like Park Avenue storage rooms that were stuffed with Louis Vuitton luggage like this. And we looked at ship models. These in the offices, the P&O company offices in London, where they display models that relate to their heritage as well as to the current activities of the company. Again, in Genoa, we visited an Italian church that, lo and behold, held sconces from a neoclassically designed Italian liner. After they came off of the liner, they were brought into the church. And I think if you found one on the street, you might think that it had been dug up from some ancient Roman burial. But these were amazing pieces. But again, we had other curatorial agendas to pursue. We saw lots of tableware, ceramics, glassware, silver. You see a very nice array of it upstairs. The very, very best, I think, is upstairs. But this was sort of the process by which we worked through in order to obtain what we really wanted to show. And more chairs. Did I mention chairs? Yeah, we saw a lot of chairs. We saw museum storages that were filled with ship models. All of which engaged on one level or another and were very interesting. But all of what I just showed you is material we considered And I think, but we passed on for one reason or another. The show includes more than 250 works. Some of our decisions were difficult, but they were based on things like the importance of the object to the storyline, the visual appeal to the public within a gallery setting where we were eventually bringing them, the condition and the prospects for restoration of an object, and the practicality of shipping something from its location to here in Salem and then on to London. And I'm slightly amused to say that because this last priority was, of course, part of the formula, but it was the least important one, I think, because we shipped some very, very inconvenient works that are now installed upstairs, and which were a big challenge, but which were an awful lot of fun, and now represent that sense of scale, which I think is so important in the exhibition. We met with other dedicated collectors along our exhibition journey. This collector has mounted the letters from the Ocean Terminal in Southampton, England, on the side of his Connecticut house. You see it now in the atrium there. They once decorated the Ocean Terminal. It would be the first thing you saw at the end of the pier as the ship was entering Southampton Ocean Terminal in the 1950s. And then when they came down, they migrated over to this side. And we learned about the only designer who worked on the SS United States who is still alive today, Mira Jedwabnik van Doren. She was born in Poland, and she came to America on board the New Amsterdam with her family on the ocean liner, of course, in 1939. And according to Mira, to hear her tell the story, she came to see the World's Fair in New York. And while they were here, World War II broke out, and they never went home, and they just became residents of New York. But I think somehow or other, looking below the surface, her parents at least knew what was going on and thought about how to tell this tale to a young girl who was likely never to see her home again, that they were going to see the World's Fair. And so for her, ocean liners are extremely important in her life. And then just when she was out of art school, she was given a contract to decorate the tables in the observation lounge of the SS United States as an enamelist. And she also tells the story that they gave her the job largely because they didn't think it could be done. Large pieces of enamel that would be fired and then remain flat and not bowed to then be seated into the framework of the table. But she chose the theme, the imagery of the stars reflected upon the water, and that's what we see here and in the table upstairs. And when she brought these table surfaces back to the lead designer to show the product that she had created, the first question was, how did you get them flat? And she wouldn't tell them how she got them flat. But she told me how she got them flat. She laid them on the ground and she put a big pillow on top of them and she sat on them and she stomped on them until they bent flat and they didn't crack. She was very pleased with that artistic technique. And she went on as a professional to create enormous panels in elevator doors. That became something that she was very well known for, much, much larger enamel. So the ocean liners were the very beginning of her career as an artist in that regard. We visited the homes of collectors where every single object, furniture, wall pictures, designs, rugs, dishes, lamps, all came from one ocean liner or another. This particular house, it was a mixture of countless liners. Other homes were evocations of a single liner or a single line. Very, very interesting to see how some of the most dedicated, avid ocean liner aficionados live. This fellow in California would travel to the beaches of Alang in India where ships get broken and get stripped out and then get disassembled for recycling their parts. And he would ship things back. And this is where the stuff that he hadn't quite gotten to cleaning up and getting ready to move out would be stored. And there's Ghislaine sort of thinking, we can't even get to the back of this storage trailer to get to see what's in the wonderful thing. And he's just gesticulating to his treasures. It's such an inspiring sort of experience to walk through his house and see what he's up to and what motivates him. And he's preserving such wonderful things that would otherwise be destroyed or just lost. Perhaps the craziest one for me, though, was to visit in Berkeley, California, a Navy test pilot from the 1950s who then went on to collect material related to the Normandie of 1935. And so here we see the confluence of his great interests, a Navy test pilot helmet, his helmet on top of the dining table designed by Émile Jacques Ruhlmann, which was on board Normandie. So one of the most elegant Art Deco table bases ever designed for a liner, with a Navy test pilot helmet on top of it. So, we're also lucky enough to receive, to have borrowed goods, a lot of things that came through the goodwill of our colleagues, I think it's fair to say, who were very happy to participate. This was a project that roused a lot of enthusiasm within the community of museums who collect this sorts of material. By now, I hope you've seen that this carving, the largest single piece of carved wood from the to survive from the interior of the Titanic, that was loaned to us by some colleagues in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was found floating in the ocean after the ship went down and it was pulled out. But a colleague in Nantucket also lent us this wonderful panel that was designed by Piero Fornasetti, who was commissioned to design the luxury suite that you see on the left there for the Andrea Doria. His sort of whimsical blue-green kind of design created this sort of surreal atmosphere. And then after the ship was hit by the Stockholm and sank, this panel was found washed up on the beach in Nantucket and was carried into the museum there. Sort of chipped and scratched. You can obviously see that it came from a shipwreck, but you can also see what the ship was looked like originally. So like the Titanic, the Andrea Doria here, we talk about these as designed ships primarily. And then there is the human interest story of the wreck behind that. But we're really looking at these as designed ships for the most part. So sometimes the most difficult installations don't come from across the ocean, but just from downstairs. So this is how our installation began, bringing our 23-foot-long model of Queen Elizabeth from the first floor up to the third floor. So about maybe a month ago now, maybe it was still even less than that, we opened up some of the gallery downstairs, brought it out, and over the course of about 8 hours and about 10 very burly guys, it was jacked up to the third floor and brought in the window and wheeled around to the gallery up there at the top. And I would show you a video of this happening, but literally it was about 8 hours, and it would be the slowest video in the Imagine. It just came up, very slowly, but it was fascinating to see how processes change over time, because you can well imagine in 1948, when it came off of the ship in New York to go into the Cunard building, it was done in a very different fashion. But in any event, that's what I think of as the quick overview. And now I'll turn the podium over to George Schwartz, curatorial scholar here at PEM, and he will tell us about some of his insights gained from work on the exhibition.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for braving on such a cold and depressing day to be here. In 1929, the Bassett Lowke Company of Northampton, UK, which was probably the premier model-making company of the ocean liner era, they ran an advertisement in which they noted that no record appears to exist to inform us as to who was the first wise man to use a model for demonstrating the advantages, beauties, or other virtues of the creation it represented. But in the distant past, even as now, these models were ever fascinating to the beholder. Easy, then, it is to understand why our great masters of the marine in the present day employ models to attract, one might say compel, the attention of a traveling public more critically and better provided for than ever in history. Now, since the beginning of the ocean liner era, steamship companies commissioned models in various forms and sizes to attract potential passengers. They used them along with posters and brochures that you see in the exhibition as sort of this large portfolio of branding their line. But ship models were really an integral art form for promoting early ocean travel and steamship lines, and exploited as a tool for advertising. And early on in the 19th century, these models were popular attractions at international expositions and fairs that were held in Europe and the United States since 1851 through the first half of the 20th century. And we see this image up here from the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. We have a model of the Inman Line City of Berlin, which was displayed in the British section of the building and was noted for its remarkable fine and exquisitely finished workmanship. But of all the objects that were talked about in a Harper's Weekly column where this comes from, this is the only illustration, and I think a testament to the popularity of ship models. So we have this mother and her two children maybe inspecting this model, perhaps in anticipation of taking a voyage on this ship themselves. And models were used continually through to the 20th century, and steamship companies started to really have their own dedicated spaces at the expositions. And here we have the Norddeutscher Lloyd exhibit at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exhibition, and a large model here of Kaiser Wilhelm II underneath this life ring. This is North German Lloyd, and has all the names of the ships in its fleet. So again, having this huge presence of supporting the line. And around the turn of the century, Cunard, CGT, Norddeutscher Lloyd, and many international lines commissioned models for prominent display in their booking offices, offering customers a taste of the monumental ships they could book passage on. And here we have the Norddeutscher Lloyd office in Bremen, and you see the little child and her parents inspecting the ship model, but also a map with tiny little models that would be moved around to show where the ships were at that moment in time. Every day they were moved on to show the position of the fleet. So really, really attracting them in. It's like, ooh, this looks like something I want to be on. And models were not displayed just in booking offices. They were put into banks. They were part of shop windows. So the branding went beyond the shipping line office itself. And so steamship lines' desire for these sleek and finely finished models gave rise to professional modeling companies that focused solely on creating these promotional ship models. And Bassett-Lowke, as I mentioned before, was the premier amongst these. And as you've seen in the exhibition upstairs, hopefully you've had a chance to wander up, and you can do so after this program. You'll see that modelers utilized many forms, from the monumental Queen Elizabeth that Dan showed you to illuminated models. But during the course of preparing this exhibition, one of the most engaging that we discovered was sectional models of vessels that were made for smaller regional offices or displayed in fairs, such as this one that's up in the exhibition in the Life on Board section of the Cunard liner Berengaria, formerly or built as the German Hamburg-American line ship Imperator, taken by the Allies after the First World War and then purchased by the Cunard line and became her signature vessel for in the 1920s. She was about 906 feet long. This model is about 5 feet long. But it's sort of an unusual method of model making. So it's a quarter rig model where one sort of half of it has been cut away, and on it has been painted a sectional painting of the entire ship. So giving you a close-up view of a mighty project at a perspective that was otherwise unattainable. And in this instance, the sectional painting was done by Montague Birrell Black, a UK artist who had done promotional artwork himself. He did advertisements for White Star Line, for Cunard, for all these international companies. And here he painted the cross-section, and Bassett-Lowke was likely the model maker that created the model. Now, sectional paintings were common during this time period. They would be in the brochures, they might be, on posters, but here we have it in this unusual form. It really allows the visitor to the booking office to engage with it. So give the would-be passenger a glimpse of her accommodations, the division of passenger, class, and crew, the technology that propelled this modern marvel, and every ship had its own personality. So let's take a deep dive into this model and maybe discover a little bit of the personality of Berengaria. So we're going to go from bow to stern and take a little close look. So here we have the forward position. Now, Berengaria was built, I said, as Imperator, which had 4 classes, the 4th being steerage. But when she was changed over and re-outfitted, that class became a 3rd class. And so we have some of the 3rd class berths down here in the forward part of the ship. Up here, we have some bakers working on something. And down below, storage for goods, for baggage, but a very unusual looking thing probably for most of us to realize, actually cars. You can take your car across the ocean. If you're in the exhibition, you'll see one of the posters actually has a car being lowered in. So here's the garage for Berengaria. So that's truly, I think, traveling in first class. So we move out and move to the heart of the ship. The first class passenger spaces extended for 7 decks amidships from the bridge past the aft funnel. And one of the great features of Berengaria was this Pompeian-style pool, which spanned the F and G decks on the ship. And had about, I think the pool was 9 feet deep. A Cunard brochure from the time period noted about this swimming pool that is naturally one of the day's chief excitements. Those who know the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Classic Court, which is the chief architectural glory of the new wing, will be able to visualize the Pompeian swimming pool on the Berengaria. From the galleries above, you can see some people there. One looks down onto the pool itself, sea green from purified ocean water, with a depth at one end of 9 feet and provision for non-swimmers on the other. In its most hilarious moments, which is every morning at and after 11 o'clock, there is diving by the more expert from the latest thing in diving boards. In the less popular hours, the wily ones slip into practice that fish-like roll, which is the newest and smartest development of the modern crawl. And the facility also had Turkish baths, Russian baths, steam showers, hot and cold rooms, rest areas, and so forth. And you can see like, you have one swimmer, hopefully showering after going into the pool for the convenience of everyone else who had to be in the pool. But below, so when all this great excitement's going on, what's going on below? You would have never experienced it on the ship, but below we have the engine room, which was converted from coal to oil when Berengaria was outfitted, reducing the number of engine room crew and allowing to have larger accommodations above. And that same Cunard brochure notes that the superlative mechanical features of the Berengaria are best appreciated from the fact that the workings of the ship never obtrude upon the consciousness of the voyager. The ship goes, the manner of means of its going are never apparent, only to the model viewer. That states the perfection of its structure and organization. There is almost no vibration from the giant, powerful turbines. The size of the vessel and the equipment of Fram-compensating tanks make it ride smoothly over the roughest seas. The Berengaria is an oil burner, and so its upper decks are never made unpleasant by the clouds of smoke that may hang in lowering weather about a vessel burning coal. So if we pop up a few decks, we could see the double-height social hall spanning the A and B decks. And one of the features of this hall was the absence of supporting pillars, so that the exception of the space occupied by the promenade decks outside, the lounge stretched across the full width of the ship, going from port to starboard. Now, if we venture a little further towards the stern, we'll see the 2-deck high dining room, which had a domed ceiling and a sweeping staircase that could be entered from E or F deck. And I think you see a little bit, here's their staircase. Here you have the chefs working hard to prepare all those first-class meals, the gastronomy afloat, as they said at that time. And the Cunard brochure. You could imagine looking at this model, maybe having this brochure, and they note that the dining saloon, that in that day, a dining saloon is what a ship is finally judged upon. Both in cuisine and service, the Berengaria fulfills the expectations aroused throughout the rest of the ship. The carte du jour offer a range of choice seldom demanded on shipboard. The markets of Europe and America supply luxuries in and out of season for the menus of Berengaria. And the service has more of the intimacy, the personal thoughtfulness of a club rather than a hotel. And above, we see some of the suites and deluxe apartments amidships, which were noted as providing an unusual number of charming single rooms for persons traveling alone. And on the other hand, there are many staterooms and suites which afford pleasant privacy to families or friends making the voyage together. And you can see a little bit of that, the private baths that were part of those first-class accommodations. And then you get still below you seeing the engines of Berengaria. And if we pop up just above the dining room, the palm court, a wonderful spacious room, but also the gymnasium, which had the, I think, the most modern equipment, as the brochure would have given you. And finally, going a little further astern, the second class, most of the second class spaces were in this area, but I think the most intriguing parts of this, probably the massive amounts of wine and beer cellars aboard, but the hanging slabs of meat, which are some of the most dynamic little aspects of this model. And then you have some second-class dining saloons above, writing rooms, and so forth. So it's just truly a wonderful, engaging model, and I encourage you all to, after, pop upstairs. There's magnifying glasses. You can inspect it, find probably unique features that I wasn't able to go into. But I think you can see why, during this time, that liner companies viewed models as wonderful publicity agents, real investments, as they said, to show off their ships in a fitting style. So I invite you to immerse yourself later this afternoon. And now I would like to introduce Ghislaine Wood, co-curator of the exhibition.
Thanks, George. That was fascinating. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here in Salem and to see this exhibition that we've been working on for many years. It's about 4 years, I think, isn't it, Dan? And it has been an extraordinary undertaking. As Dan said, it's grown out of a huge amount of research into ocean liner material. I was formerly in the V&A. I'm still a V&A fellow. And I'd been crossing over ocean liner material in many different contexts. I did a big Art Deco show in 2003, and we included Art Deco ocean liner material in that exhibition. But it was quite clear that it was extraordinary that there had never been a major exhibition that had really encompassed this amazing international story. So I think we're very proud of this exhibition and very proud that, and probably something this ambitious won't be undertaken for many years to come. So I'm going to look at a panel from the Normandie ship by Jean Dupin. Now, it is one of my favourite objects in the exhibition. It is extraordinary. It does sum up, you know, the extreme luxury of some of these interwar ships, and arguably the greatest expression of Art Deco. So the Normandie, it was an extraordinary ship. It took many years for it to come to fruition, the Normandie. It was an extremely expensive undertaking, and it was planned for earlier in the 30s. But it didn't actually, it needed French government subsidy to get it finished. And in fact, it didn't sail, it wasn't launched until 1935. It was the most expensive ship of the interwar period. But most importantly, it was seen, like many of these ships, as an expression of state. We've described it as a kind of floating fragment of France. The Normandie really sort of tried to represent the ideals, the aspirations of a nation. And it followed along a number of different events during the 20s and 30s, which were really about sort of economic prowess and establishing France as an important centre for the production of and consumption of luxury goods. I mean, of course, now we all accept that France is, is one of the great centres of luxury brands, but this is really the period in which this was consolidated in France, and it was through things like the International Exhibition of 1925, the Normandie, the Colonial Exhibition of 1931, where France established its command of sort of luxury consumption. So I don't know if I can use this. Right. So yeah. So just to show you where the Jean Dupart panel came from. What was extraordinary about Normandie, and it grew out of the German ships, the Europa and the Bremen, was that it created a very large central access, main access through the ship, so that a series of very dramatic rooms in enfilade could be created. And here we see the steps going down into the smoking room, and this is the Grand Salon. So this is the room that had the extraordinary Jean Dupart Berengaria panels in. And this was one of the most dramatic spaces of any ship ever. Here we see a black and white photograph of it. The Jean Dupart scheme sat in the four corners of the room. There were four sort of panels, sets of panels. It was over 400 square metres of glass verre glamise, which is a technique I'll come on to. So it was an absolutely extraordinary undertaking, and it was designed by Jean Dupart, but it was executed by a glass expert at Saint-Gobain in France. Yes, and we'll look a bit more in detail at him in a moment. But just to establish why Jean Dupart got this commission, Dupart was probably the leading classical artist of the period, and this is an extremely well-known room from the Paris exhibition of 1925. It's the Hôtel du Collectionneur, designed by Jacques-Émile Ruhlmann. So this is all Ruhlmann furniture within the interior. But here we see really the focal point of the room, which is the Les Perruches, the parrots, which was really the painting that established Jean Dupart's reputation as the leading artist of sort of conservative modern style in France, and it was hugely reported upon at the time. So here is the painting. We were lucky enough to have this in the Art Deco exhibition in 2003. But what you'll also see, if I just go back, is of course there is this Aubusson tapestry furniture, which of course we will see again in a moment in the Normandie, and here it is. So actually a lot of the decorative scheme for the Grand Salon in the Normandie had already been established at the Paris exhibition of 1925. But if you just bear in mind this very particular stylistic approach to the figure of Jean Dupart, I mean, she became known as the Dupart woman. These extremely elongated figures, which again we see in the great scheme in the Grand Salon. But of course, Dupart had also worked on previous French ships. I mean, we must remember that the Normandie came at the end of a series of extraordinary and incredibly luxurious French ships. The Paris in 21, which kind of fused Art Nouveau and Art Deco, the first full expression of Art Deco in the Ile-de-France in 1927, followed by the Atlantique, which sadly burned within 2 years of it being built, but was another great ship, and then finally, the pinnacle, the Normandie in 1935. But of course, here we see another wonderful Dupart painting. This is the Sylvie. It was based on a French novel. And of course, we also see this preoccupation with with the classical figure, this sort of this very particular approach of 1930s classicism to the figure. And this is Alfred Janeo, and he was another artist like Dupas, who was part of this Bordeaux school. They were all from the southwest of France. They trained at the École de Beaux-Arts in Bordeaux, and there was a number of very important artists who came out of that school, but Dupas was probably the leading figure. So Poujon, Despujol, a number of them doing major commissions in the French expos. So then we move on to the Grand Salon. The Grand Salon was 140 metres long. It was an extraordinary room. The panels themselves were 15 metres high. But I just want you to sort of bear in mind this. So what's interesting in the Grand Salon as well is that it had these giant windows that opened onto the deck outside, and that was quite unusual. That was a new development. So it was this sense of daylight coming in from the promenade deck into the room. And of course, that bears a great resemblance. So here, again, you'll see the large windows on either side. But that bears a great resemblance to this. And this is really what the Grand Salon was trying to achieve. And this is really about how France was trying to position herself as, the great arbiter of taste and culture and luxury. And this, of course, is the Galerie des Glaces at Versailles. And at the time, the Grand Salon was compared to this room. Now, the Galerie des Glaces was only 73 metres long. But, of course, we can see the colour scheme. We can see the sense of the daylight coming in, this use of glass, the gold cabinet it was known as. And, of course, in all of the press at the time of the launch of the Normandie, they compared this space to Versailles with obvious sort of implications. So there we go. I sort of tried to pull in a picture that gives this sense of this glowing gold cabinet, this incredibly luxurious interior, and of course conveyed not just in the glasswork, which used gold leaf, silver, palladium leaf, but also in the decoration of the furniture, and we'll come on and look at that. But I just wanted to say a little bit about Vert Aiglemise, because it is, again, in the technique itself, it was highlighting great French traditions. So Vert Aiglemise was a technique that was developed in France. The Huguenots took it to Britain, and there was quite a lot of Vert Aiglemise produced. But the name comes from Jean-Baptiste Aiglemise, who was a French glassmaker. And, of course, when we look at the detail of this mirror, this is a mirror, I think, in the V&A's collection, so I've just pulled one as an example. But you can see the way that much Vert Aiglemise use classical imagery. So it's not surprising in some ways that this very classical language and iconography that Dupas explores is done in this technique, because that's a very familiar iconography for Vert Aiglemise. Now, Vert Aiglemise is reverse painted glass. So basically, it's glass with mirror and then various different metals applied to the back of it, which show through, and then they would be covered with canvas and mounted onto the wall. And as I say, it's very much associated with 18th century France and, of course, the great court of Louis XIV and XV. So I show the most remarkable survival of this scheme. This is the wall that is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sadly, very rarely on display. I don't know, Dan, if you can remember the last time you saw it. It's not on display. It's a great shame. It would have been wonderful to have it for this show, but it is very, very fragile material and very, very difficult to travel. But I'd urge anyone to go and see this in the Met next time they put it out. But here we see much of the imagery of the scheme. It was a water theme. The theme was navigation, and there were 4 different panels that looked at the birth, the Chariot of Poseidon, the Chariot of Thetis, the birth of Aphrodite, and the Rape of Europa. So again, all themes to do with water and the cycle of the day, the rising of the sun, the setting of the sun. So there are the schemes. Dupas very interestingly talks about his technique, and he talked about always creating these very, very complete cartoons in quarter scale, which were then scaled up, and he would either do it with photography or just drawing. But we're lucky that the four complete cartoons the panels survive. But you can see it's a sort of fantasy of marine imagery, sort of these fancy galleons, you know, the sea gods, the mermaids, you know, this extraordinary sort of wave form that appears throughout the scheme. So the panel upstairs, which I have to say we're very lucky, is one of the most beautiful panels that we could have got because it's got this lovely use of other colours. There were highlights of other colours in the panels. Some of them had pink. It wasn't just gold and silver. Now this panel sits, you can just see her there, maybe, if you've got very good eyesight. But you get a sense of how big these were when you look at the panel upstairs. But there we go, the absolutely typical Dupas classical form. What's lovely here is we've also got the calla lily, so it's this sense of, you know, that was associated with sort of purity, and of course the rape of Europa is a particularly brutal myth, but here we've got, you know, these female figures associated with sort of, you know, the great sort of ideas of classicism. And I just wanted to touch on some of the other decoration in the room very, very briefly, because, of course, it was this glowing interior, and one of the ways that that effect was created was through the Gaudissart Aubusson tapestry that was on the furniture, which was this beautiful orange, and there's one of these chairs upstairs. But there was also a pale grey, so it was this very sort of, you know, incredibly rich scheme. And of course, all the iconography within the entire Normandy, but particularly in this room, had meaning. And these chairs were decorated with flowers from the French colonies. This was quite a common theme on the interwar ships. They quite often were expressions of colonial possession. And just to sort of to look at the rest of the scheme in this room, because I think it's quite important to think that it wasn't just the verre glamise. You've also got lacquer, which is another extraordinary, rich, very expensive technique. And of course, lacquer was seen as being quite appropriate for ships because it was more fire resistant than wood panelling. So it was used in the Atlantique and in the Normandie in huge areas. But this is the chariot of Aurora, also designed by Dupas. That sat over the doors that connected the Grand Salon here into the fumoir, the smoking room. And this is the smoking room. So just adjacent to the Grand Salon, you also get this immensely dramatic room. So again, this idea of the enfilade, going back to Versailles, this idea of a series of increasingly dramatic rooms as you move through the ship. And just to show some of the other material from that room, this is Les Spores by Jean Dunant, which, if we go back, you can see it on the wall here. But again, this colour scheme of gold. But just to sort of, you know, end with the fact that, of course, you know, these were entertaining spaces. They were used. There's wonderful film upstairs of people sort of, you know, drinking and dancing and you know, using the Normandy spaces despite their almost intimidating grandeur. But of course, it is terribly sad that Normandy existed for 4 years. She was on her way from Le Havre to New York when war broke out and when France fell. And so she remained in New York, where she was in the process of being refitted as a troop ship after the Pearl Harbor. When she caught fire, the objects were being taken off, but a fire broke out in the Grand Salon, and of course she burned overnight. And in the attempt to put out the fire, she, I'm afraid, filled with water and overturned in New York Harbour, where she stayed, I think, for quite a long time. I think it was over a year, wasn't it, before they actually towed her out and scrapped her. So a very sad end to arguably, you know, the greatest Art Deco object ever created. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Wilson. I am from Boston, and I am the president of a design firm in Boston that about half of our practice is the design of cruise ships. So I'm a little humble to follow three scholars because I will completely clobber all the French names. I can't talk poetically about the history. So what I'm going to try to do is bridge the gap from this really incredibly colorful history to the current day. So I'm gonna try to set the stage for how these two ships that were just featured fit into an extremely long lineage of ocean liners, which, with a little bit of a short hiatus, became the industry of cruise lines. So I'm gonna just talk about some facts, but there's some actually common threads that happen here. This is very much about competition. It's about branding. It's about nationalism. It is about boasting rights. So the models were about outdoing the other guy or the other country or the other brand. And the core of what they were always bragging about was speed, luxury. It's ironic. I literally just came from 5 days of working on a new ship last week or this past week, and in that week we did in fact talk about rooms without pillars. We did in fact talking about how high could it go. We talked about the water in the pool. Is it the biggest pool ever, et cetera, et cetera. So the themes haven't changed. So we thought we'd take these two ships and we'd do a summary of what their benchmarks were, including their bragging rights. So the Imperator, as it was christened when it was built, bragged about having a gymnasium, bragged about having baths and spas, bragged about private bathrooms, and they were, of course, the longest. Right? You'll find a theme here that the latest and greatest ship is always the longest, the biggest, the fastest, etc. If you want to keep track of it, you'll see this in a minute. 900 feet long, 4,000 passengers. You'll actually notice that the passenger counts go down. We've seen a lot of this already. So these are the bragging rights visualized. There's the pool. There's the dining room. But what you will begin to see here, and it wasn't really mentioned, you talked about Deco and you talked about the Victorian design, but they weren't following trends in the ocean liner industry. They were setting trends. The ocean liners were almost always the vanguard of style. So before Art Deco became a common word in the lexicon of design, it was showing up on the cruise ships or on the ocean liners. And the same was true almost of every era. You go to the Normandie, and she's a bit longer. She's dropped in passenger count quite a bit, but now we're getting to the largest room ever. Again, brag, brag, brag. The designers that are brought in are names, recognizable names. Again, bragging points. Again, the style is on the vanguard. It is setting trends. It is literally the equivalent to the international exhibitions being brought into practice. I'm going to put in the QE2 because the QE2 is kind of, in a way, the QE2 in the United States marked the end of the glamour of the ocean liner. The QE2, when she was launched, was for a short period of time the fastest ship on the seas, and its status as the fastest way to get from Europe to the best way to get from Europe to the United States was quickly eclipsed by the introduction of the jetliner. And the introduction of the jetliner very much started to mark the demise of the ocean liner Glamour. But this was one of the fastest ships ever built. It was also yet again on the vanguard of style, this time modernism. I love, we would now look at the upper right-hand corner. We would now look at that and use words like dated. But at the time, this was the epitome of modernism. It goes right hand in hand with Palm Springs and Las Vegas and Frank Sinatra and all of the mid-century modernism that we now clamor to renovate. I put in the Titanic because ever since the movie Titanic, it became the benchmark of ocean liners, and it is in fact. You'll see in a minute that it is a relatively small ship. So I'm going to take the two ships we've seen so far, and I'm going to use Titanic as a benchmark. So here is the Berengaria, bigger, faster, more stylish. Here's the QE2, even bigger again, longer, faster. I'm going to jump to the late 20th century. The Millennium class ship from Celebrity is yet again bigger, not as long, but you notice it's starting to grow up in height. And the growth in height is a byproduct of the growth in technology. And technology, particularly beginning in the mid-'80s, when they could actually build three-dimensional computer models of the ship, and they could completely run them through their naval architectural distress and figure out where the boundaries were of failure. When they were designing the Normandie in the United States, they were still very much analog. Kind of, even though we went to the moon, we went to the moon with slide rules. And the fact that the shipyards could now model electronically and push the technology boundaries, they could actually start to push the ships. So that began a series of who can build the bigger, faster, larger ships. So then Celebrity built, they're getting larger. And then this Independence of the Sea is one of Royal Caribbean's ships. This was part of a fleet of 8 ships that started out somewhat shorter and then grew in length. These were the first ships, the cruise ships, that could not pass through the Panama Canal. And up until that time, everybody said, well, we can't build something that won't go through the Panama Canal. And then other people said, well, why? We never go through the Panama Canal. So suddenly the ships are getting larger, right? With this growth comes the continuation of the tradition of trying to outdo the other guy. Now, I'm featuring a lot of Royal Caribbean and Celebrity ships because they're my client, and I happen to have an incredible inventory of data, but their competitors were doing the same thing. So it was every year there would be a new ship that was trying to outdo the other brands. And then we get to what is today the largest ships in the world, Oasis of the Seas, and they are... by comparison, the Berengaria barely holds a candle. So you can see now how the Titanic stacks up against the Oasis. Of course, you would never see this, but due to Photoshop, you can do this, right? So this is obviously a computer-generated model of the Titanic. Steaming under, I believe that's probably the Verrazano Bridge, and it's about to be overtaken by Oasis. Now, clearly what you see here is that in addition to length and height, these ships have become incredibly robust and beamy. So once it was decided, why bother trying to get through the Panama Canal, then the next question is, why bother to stay skinny at all? So what you find in a ship like this now is that it has become so stable that issues of comfort and vibration and ship moving almost become irrelevant, that it's so large. So we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution, because I think the conversation that Dan and I had the first time we met was this recognition that even today the cruise lines are on the vanguard of design, and they are always trying to stay one step ahead of the style curve. So I would literally say that before W Hotel was doing boutique hotels. The cruise ships were trying to define what a boutique cruise ship was like. And it's fun to take threads of this tapestry and go through it. So in this case, you go from the pool on the Berengaria, the pool on the Normandie, the pool on the QE2, and the pool on Celebrity Solstice. Somewhere with the QE2, they realized, well, why are we doing an indoor pool? People want to sit in the sun, so that was the beginning of that trend. Those kind of trends continue through dining rooms to modern day dining room. I believe this is on an Oasis ship. To lounges, Victorian, Deco, modern, and then very boutique-y. And then if you put this ship into context, it is now up at 5,400 passengers. That's a double berth number. That is, divide that by 2 and you get the number of staterooms. It actually can hold, I believe, 7,600 passengers when you bring in all the extra berths for your kids and your grandparents. And it is astonishingly at 225,000 tons. That's 3 times the physical size of the previous ocean liners. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what happens when you design such a ship that seems a little bit monstrous. So the ship becomes so large at this point that it's not a single entity. It is a collection of neighborhoods that all fit together into one ship. So because we're in the marketing world, we have to come up with names for these neighborhoods. So one of them is called Central Park. The park is, to put it in size, it's the length of a football field. It's 18 meters wide. It has 2,200 custom-made aluminum containers with real plants, and it is maintained on a weekly basis. Entertainment is a combination of sexy glamour combined with technology, and it pushes the boundaries in many ways. The theaters on these ships they rival some of the biggest Broadway theaters. They were up to 1,450 seats in the theater now. It's a long ways from the lady doing the handstands in the Salon. And then to completely and constantly outdo the competitors, the performances and the entertainment are very broadly based, including entire water shows on the back of the ship, kind of lifted straight out of Las Vegas, if you will. And then when you have so many passengers, you need a lot of variety. So we have ice shows, ice skating rinks. And then for the kids, we're constantly trying to outdo a theme park and outdo a Disney. So this is a slide called the Ultimate Abyss. This slide drops 8 stories. So how do you get there? So as designers, we have a whole series of tools that we use that are traditional. And with every passing year, our reliance on technology becomes more and more important. On Oasis, you begin to do simple diagrams that explain the neighborhoods. This was the entertainment district. This was the shopping district. That was the park. This was a district called the Boardwalk, which is themed heavily like Coney Island. This is a plan of Central Park showing all the paving. This is a rendering looking through one of the lounges out to the Boardwalk. And then as we advance, we do a large combination of computer-generated models. We have entire digital walkthroughs that we can walk our clients and our customers through the ship before it's done. This is actually a rendering of the same photograph you saw. At a passing glance, it's hard to tell which are which. We do mock-ups, and we do traditional models. Everybody asks me, how do they build the ships? And I think to the layperson, the belief is that there's still a bunch of riveters out there riveting plates of steel together. And this is so incredibly advanced right now, it even boggles the mind for me when I go there, and I've been to the shipyards at least several hundred times. So this shows you how they build a ship today. Everything is modular. Everything is computer generated. Every part has been cut by a robot, not by a person. It's welded by robots, really not by people. And it's assembled like a pre-assembled kit of parts. I put this in here because on the right, you see an entertainment venue here, and you see that big pillar right there. These are robotic television screens, but that pillar is right there. And this is half of that room sitting on a platform waiting to be lifted as a unit into the dry dock to plug it on. And then here's the two halves together, and what's kind of fun is here's the second half, and it hasn't quite been set down into position yet. You can see the gap. And when they put these together, it's remarkable how they fit together. And then these are currently the 3 largest ships in the world. And is this where we have a video? Yeah, we're going to show you this this is prepared by the shipyard. It's just, it's too cool not to show. We had to make a Lego kit of this so we can sell it, huh? So out in the lobby, my colleagues from our office who do a lot of our modeling are out there, Alistair and Stephen, and you're going to see a series of models. This is one of them, and I'm just going to flip you through to show you the objects. Now, the point here is that the design of cruise ships is very much evolutionary from a long tradition of ocean liners, but somewhere along the line, as our Royal Caribbean client would say, it became revolutionary. So in the fast-paced world of today's technology, evolution is moving so quickly that it's kind of hard to keep up with it. So I thought I'd show you the models that are on display to encourage you to get out there and to show you the finished product. So this is a model of what we call the Lawn Club on the top of a celebrity ship, real grass. And this is the completed ship. This is a model of a theater on one of the celebrity ships, and here's the completed room. I love the accuracy of the artwork on the ceiling. Again, the tradition of hiring artists, commissioning artwork for the room. And then sort of talk about how, just send the message home that the tradition continues today, and who knows what the future has in front of us. Thank you. Up we go.
Yes. Sit down here. Each of our speakers will turn on their mic so they can be heard. I'm very pleased. Thank you all for that. Each of you addressed pretty much precisely what I was hoping you would address. But just one thing, in case it wasn't clear to everyone here, can you just tell us about the next late great concept for cruise ships that's in design? And if you can't, can you tell us why you can't?
Is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
No, I can't. I'd probably be dismissed as one of the designers, but as we talked about, it is extremely competitive, and things are relatively top secret. For the same reason you see new sports cars on the test track wrapped in blankets. There's a lot of roving eyes and a lot of snoopy people out there trying to gather stuff. So we can only talk back. I can tell you anything about something that was released in a press release a day ago, but I can't tell you anything about what's not released yet.
Well, I can guarantee that my question was entirely innocent. I'm not a snoop for any other company in the cruise industry.
But I think just broadly, I think the design direction at a stylistic level. Forget everybody's always going to try to be bigger, faster, better. If you have 12 things, I'm going to try it for 14, right? But I think stylistically they watch the demographics very carefully. The small fraction of the potential audience that they've captured so far makes them realize that the growth is potentially unlimited. But the growth in the 50 to 70 age bracket we're going to start dying off, and the ability to capture a younger audience is definitely really taken off. But stylistically, the younger audience is more laid back. They're more casual. You will not see much on cruise ships today, people dressed in these beautiful evening gowns, strolling through grand salons. We use words like barefoot chic and laid back as so just like the workplace has become a t-shirt and khaki shorts, cargo shorts kind of environment, the leisure market is becoming a market like that too.
Well, that's a sobering thought, then, isn't it?
It is a sobering thought, but that doesn't mean that it isn't just as beautifully and wonderfully crafted.
I get that point. And to that point, Ghislaine, you and I talked about an awful lot of ships with a lot of very distinctive characteristic designs, and then sought out what we could about some of these ships, and many of them have very few, if any, surviving remnants at all. As we went through, do you remember certain designs for certain ships that you wish we had been able to represent, or things that were particularly appealing, specialized designs?
Well, can you hear me? Yes, no. Well, as you know, Dan, there was lots and lots of things that we'd love to have had in the exhibition which we couldn't have. I suppose what's striking is how much has survived, actually. At the beginning of this whole process, there were obviously the things that I knew of in the V&A's collections and things that had appeared over the course of sort of 10 years of research on other projects. But we didn't really have a clear sense of how much existed, to do with national ships. So, for instance, Italy, we didn't really know how much was still there representing the great Italian ships of both the interwar and post-war period. So that was a lovely surprise to realise that there was material. Sadly, we weren't able to borrow a lot of it, but it's great to know it's there. I think, what's important going forward, and I hope this exhibition highlights this, that these are very important stories for individual nations. Particularly in the British context, we have a National Maritime Museum, we have museums in Southampton and Liverpool, but very few of them focus on the story of ocean liners. They might focus on Nelson or on, so I kind of think going forward it would be great if the culture can be kind of pulled together and shown more coherently, perhaps. But yeah, lots of wonderful things. The Queen Mary, amazing survival. If any of you get the chance, you must go to the Queen Mary. It's amazing how many original rooms still exist on the Queen Mary. Yeah.
So, George, just quickly, you looked at a few models for this project. Other than the great one that we explored a little bit there, are there any quirky ones in particular that stick in your mind?
I think the quirkiest ones are the ones that were maybe put into very unusual places. They probably don't exist anymore. When researching for a bunch of models, I found an article from a Pittsburgh newspaper that was advertising in 1936. They had borrowed an illuminated model of the Queen Mary to put in the Boggs department store in the fashion section to advertise Cunard's latest Cunard Red fashion items and other things. So a 6-foot, illuminated model within the middle of, probably dresses and so forth. And a quirky model that came up is when the Holland American line built its new Pier 40 in the 60s. Very square-looking building, which exists in some form today. On the roof, there was a 38-foot model of Rotterdam that you can see if you were driving from the west, the West Highway, the FDR Drive. You can see, and a lot of people would mention seeing that. But I also found that, the model, like the Queen Elizabeth model, models like that were made 20 years before. There was an 18-foot model of Titanic. It cost a good sum, and it was sent to America, the tour America, before Titanic was ever sailed. So, this promotional aspect was really very, very early on.
I don't see Scott taking notes there, stealing ideas for future presentations there. So maybe they played in the past better than they would in the present day. Does anyone in the audience have questions for speakers? Yes.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. How do you design such a huge ship and not make it into a hugely unpleasant experience with too many people? Is that a fair way to re-say it? So I think the first part of the question is to recognize the possibility of that happening, and then begin in the master planning phases to plan the ship before it's even designed, but to plan the ship to avoid that. And the best way to understand it is to think of it like a city, right? So a city is broken up into neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are broken up into blocks, and collections of blocks have a park, and there's a corner store. And even though I live in a neighborhood of Boston, rarely do I experience the entire population of Boston because I kind of live in my neighborhood. So on the ships that preceded Oasis, the Voyager and Independence class ships, we began this notion of breaking it up into neighborhoods for smaller groups of the passenger population. But when we got to Oasis, the footprint, both in terms of its width, its girth, and its length, and therefore the pad allowed it to truly be divided up into neighborhoods. So to make that work, you needed to create a central space that became the nucleus, the heart of each of those neighborhoods. So there's a shopping district, and when you're in that shopping district, instead of feeling like you're there with 5,000 of your closest new friends, you're there with 1,000 of them. And the same is true of Boardwalk. The same is true of Central Park. And there are a lot of places on the ship clearly deliberately described and defined as refuges, places to go and get away. And my wife and I just took our entire family there, and I have to tell you, it was even hard to figure out where the rest of our family was, because you can divide yourself up so well that you don't know where everybody is, and rarely do you ever feel like you're on such a large ship. But I think if you just kept making the ships bigger and bigger and bigger, it would have been a catastrophe. I mean, because you would have created spaces where everybody wants to be in that space at the same time. And a lot of it's about programming and how you program the use of the ship too.
Yes.
When it comes to the malls that you were talking about, the ones you've seen, from our experience, they make malls of the hull. Did you come across all of those for like aerodynamic, for like the flow of the ship through the water? Did you get? I haven't managed to go around the exhibit yet. Have you got some of those instead of actual like exhibition malls that were like presenting to like the passengers?
Sure. No, I think you will be quite surprised by the one you will encounter within the second gallery of the exhibition. 22-foot long hull model of SS United States. It's the original test tank model that was used, as you said, to drag through the water to test the accuracy of the design to make sure it cut in the way they wanted. As well, in that same gallery, a equally long 19-foot plating model for the SS United States. So yes, yeah, we wanted to sort of capture that model making in all of the different facets.
I have a question about speed. I believe the Independence class vessel that you put up on the screen, the cruising speed is at 22 knots, and the Queen Elizabeth, the cruising speed was 28 knots with a maximum speed of 30
something, yeah.
Yeah. The modern day vessels, because of their size, is their cruising speed reduced as such? Or
No, it's because of their itinerary, there's no need to go any faster. So the Normandie and the United States, and before that generations of other ships, were competing for what was called the blue riband, right? Am I saying it right? It was the bragging rights for being the fastest ship from either Southampton or France to New York Harbor. And the goal was to get across the Atlantic in 7 days, do a turnaround, get back to Europe in 7 days, do a turnaround, so that the crews on any one of these ships would leave Southampton at 5 p.m. every Saturday night. And to do that, they had to do that turn. So in the cruise market, our goal is, because it's puddle jumping from port to port to port, the goal is to get to that port overnight efficiently and as economically as they can in terms of fuel consumption, and there's no need to go that fast.
Yeah, your mention of fuel consumption I think is important, because just because the ships could go that fast, the ocean liners, doesn't mean they did. So a ship would operate at its peak speed maybe on its maiden voyage or the first voyage that had clear weather, with the hope of breaking the record, but that was highly inefficient in terms of fuel. So the average crossing was barely ever using that kind of efficiency, and or that kind of speed rather. And at the same time, built with subsidies, they needed the capacity to run that fast for troop transports or for outrunning submarines and whatnot, but that wasn't their day-to-day kind of business at all, I think.
They also, crossing the Atlantic, they would hit seas like your very first slide, right? So if when they hit weather like that, they had to run slow, and then they needed the ability to make up speed and arrive on time. So once they were in good weather, then they needed to make up speed. So a lot's changed. First of all, weather prediction alone keeps most of the ships out of that kind of circumstance.
I was fascinated with watching the ship being put together. So you said you did it in sections. So were those built on site in sections and then put together? And how long does it take to do something like that? And if you can, what is the cost of something?
The questions were a little more detail about putting it together. How long does it take to build a ship, and how much does it cost? So and it varies clearly. Let me answer some of the cool things about building the ships. So they build them in smaller blocks, and they build the smaller blocks upside down, right? And they build them upside down so they can put all the cables and pipes and ductwork into the ceiling, or what will become the ceiling, but essentially when they're building it, it's on the floor. So you're working upside down in the ceiling. And then when that block is all fitted out, not with the interior fit out, but with all of the technical stuff, then they tip it upside down, then they move it into an assembly block place where they start to stack them up. And when they get to what they call the grand blocks, so on a big ship, there might be 20 to 40 grand blocks. And these are usually now at that point, they're a half of a ship in width and maybe almost a full fire zone in length, depends on the fire zone, and 4 to 5 decks in height. then those grand blocks then are set in the building block. That basically means that you can be building the top of the ship at almost the same time that you're building the bottom of the ship. So the ships are in the dock themselves from as little as 16 months to as long as 24 months. But by comparison to land, that's like speed of light. Depending upon the competitive marketplace, a ship project will be between 36 and 60 months from concept to delivery. The Oasis class ship, the first one was $1.2 billion, and the second one, the nearly identical one, was 100 million less, round numbers. So there's like literally $100 million in engineering and prototyping and testing and wind tunnel testing and water tank testing and computational modeling and all that.
Yes.
How did the idea for the exhibition come about? I don't know if that's to Ghislaine or Dan or both.
Do you want to handle that, Ghislaine?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, basically, I'd been working on a number of projects in the V&A and kept coming across ocean liner material in the V&A's collection. So I did a big show on Art Deco in 2003, which actually came to the MFA here in Boston. And I realised there was a lot of material that no one really had ever looked at. And it had been collected as examples of good design rather than as maritime design. And then I'd also worked on a big exhibition we did at the V&A for the London Olympics, which was on post-war British design, and looked at a number of British ships, the Canberra, the Orion, a lot of the the ships that didn't come to the States but went to Australia, and of course QE2, which has been said, it was a fantastic, incredibly progressive ship. I mean, particularly by British standards. And I kind of thought, wow, it's amazing no one's ever done an international show on ocean liners, and I was working on it. And then, Dan, do you want to take over on?
And I was working on it, and it had been in the back of our minds here, and it had always been sort of a secondary project. As soon as we get rid of the one we were getting, get it up on display, we'll get to that ocean liner project. And we'd been collecting the material with this notion that we were going to do something more ambitious than had ever been done before. And we had just put it on our books as a project. I think it was for 2015 or 16 at that time, when one of our overseers, who happened to be friendly with the director of the V&A, and they had lunch together, and he heard that there was this curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum who was also interested in ocean liners. So we got together and fomented a cooperative project that seemed to fit together so much better than either one of us would have pulled off on our own. So it was really a great matter of timing and symbiosis, and really very, very closely paired sets of goals, which was actually very surprising, because I think we each had an outline for the exhibition as we walked in, and they were very close to being identical. And then we got right down to the fun part of figuring out the best
I think
objects.
the strength of this project is it's drawn on a lot of, it's very interdisciplinary, in the sense that if you'd just been in the V&A, it would have been very design history focused, and obviously bringing maritime history into it. But there's been a number of people involved in the project, as you'll see from the book. A number of sort of experts in different disciplines have contributed to that. So it's been quite an interdisciplinary project, and that, I think, has been a tremendous strength.
So I know that somebody up in the front here knows a lot about ocean liners. Are we just about out of time? Is this one more question, or? Okay, Peter.
In relation to the V&A, is everything from this exhibit going there, including the enormous model of the Queen Elizabeth, and are you adding things in England and from Europe to your exhibit over there?
Yeah. Well, we're not, very sadly, we're not taking the Queen Elizabeth model, because that would have been very, very expensive. And, but fortunately, there's one very, very similar across the road in the Science Museum. So we're going to borrow that one. So I think about 85% of the exhibition is the same. So yeah, the majority of it and the structure of the exhibition remains the same. We're not taking some of the American material, which is a bit less relevant for British audiences, but we also are adding quite a lot of material relating to ships that went to the Far East and to Australia. So those ships like the Canberra, the Orion, the Orcades, which are very important to British audiences. So we're adding a bit, and then there's one or two other, loans. But yeah, it's more or less the same, but there's more British material.
I just would add that in case you don't get enough of it here, and you want to go to London between February into early June of next year, of course, there's a good place to see it. But after that, it will go to Dundee, Scotland, to the new V&A building that's underway there. So I intend to see it in all three places. I hope you all do too as well. And I want to thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I'll be wandering through the galleries a little later on. I encourage you to spend some time in the atrium looking at the Wilson Butler models and the other activities there, and maybe I'll see you upstairs. So thanks very much.